Welcome to the Health Headliner podcast by Tudu Digital. Our content is informational only and not medical advice. Please consult your provider. Now, let's dive into today's headlines.
Imagine being able to spot the very earliest whispers of Alzheimer's disease just by playing a video game,
Yeah.
years before any memory problems even become noticeable.
Yeah, that sounds almost like science fiction, doesn't it?
It really does. But today we're diving deep into some, pretty fascinating research from Rutgers University that suggests this could actually become a reality.
Mm-hmm.
We're looking at a new study. It was published in Alzheimer's Research and Therapy by the Aging and Brain Health Alliance at Rutgers Newark.
Okay.
And our goal today really is to understand how this non-invasive video game test could be just as good, potentially, as blood tests at finding those very early signs of Alzheimer's.
And we're talking really early, right? Like potentially a decade or more before the traditional methods.
Exactly, potentially years before.
Oh.
We also have the details from the scientific paper itself, which it's got a bit of a mouthful for a title. Elevated plasma phosphorylated tau-231 is associated with reduced generalization and medial temporal lobe dynamic network flexibility among healthy older African Americans.
Right. Quite specific. So a lot to unpack there, focusing on specific biomarkers and brain functions.
Definitely. So let's get into what this all really means for you listening.
Well, I think what's really interesting to consider right from the start is how this shifts our whole perspective on early detection.
Yeah.
For so long, we've kind of waited for clear cognitive decline to show up before even, thinking about Alzheimer's.
Yeah, that's the standard approach.
But this work out of Rutgers, which we see in the news reports and the actual scientific findings, it really hints at a future where we can maybe identify these changes much, much earlier.
Exactly. And think about the standard cognitive tests people use now, like drawing a clock face or trying to remember a list of words.
The memory tests, yeah.
The researchers point out that those often just miss the boat. The actual brain changes linked to Alzheimer's could be happening for like 10 to 15 years before anyone notices those kinds of problems.
That's a huge window of time.
It is. Plus, those standard tests, they can sometimes be influenced by things like, how much education someone has or even their cultural background.
That's such a critical point, thinking about who current testing might be missing or misinterpreting. And the Rutgers team, they really emphasize that their method aims to get around some of those limitations.
Mm-hmm.
They spent the last, 20 years developing this video game-based screening tool.
Yeah, long time.
And this latest study, it offers even stronger proof that it might be able to detect these subtle reductions in brain function much earlier than we could with those traditional approaches.
And here's where it gets really compelling, I think, for you listening. This study indicates that this video game test could be giving us results that are basically on par with these new blood tests, the ones that look for specific markers of Alzheimer's in the body.
Just think about that for a second. A game you play on a computer, potentially revealing the same early signs as a blood draw.
It's pretty remarkable.
Absolutely. And the advantages of something like this are, considerable. The video game is non-invasive, right? So no needles, no discomfort.
Which is a big plus for many people.
Huge. And it also doesn't require a blood sample or, highly specialized technicians to administer it. That really opens the door to much wider, maybe more frequent screening possibilities for a lot more people.
Yeah, accessibility.
And the researchers also suggest, it could end up being more cost-effective for doctors and the whole healthcare system in the long run.
And it's not just about spotting the disease earlier in individuals, is it? Mark Gluck, the neuroscientist who directs the lab, he brings up a really significant point for actually developing new treatments.
Oh, for the drug trials.
Yeah. He believes that being able to identify people in these very, very early stages could be a total game changer for clinical trials.
How so?
Well, by finding participants who are just starting to experience the underlying biological changes of Alzheimer's, researchers could test potential new drugs much earlier in the disease process.
Right.
When they might have the biggest impact.
Right. Hitting it before significant damage is done.
Exactly. And that could potentially speed up the whole process of finding effective therapies.
That's a very logical and honestly a very hopeful prospect. If you can target those earliest biological shifts, you're giving potential treatments the best possible chance to work. This could really be a major step forward in the search for effective interventions.
So let's talk a bit more about this video game itself. It's referred to as a generalization task.
Mm-hmm.
What does that actually involve for someone playing it?
Okay, so at its core, the game is designed to evaluate a specific aspect of your cognitive abilities. Basically, how well you can learn a rule and then apply that rule in slightly different new situations.
Okay.
In this particular study, the rules involved identifying patterns in colors and shapes. So participants would see a series of examples and they'd have to figure out the underlying pattern.
Like red circles always go with blue squares or something.
Something like that, yeah. And then they'd have to use that understanding to correctly respond to new combinations of these colors and shapes they hadn't seen before in that exact way.
It sounds simple on the surface, but I can see how that could really tap into some fundamental ways our brains process information and learn.
Yeah,
That flexibility.
exactly. And the researchers emphasize that it only requires a basic understanding of shapes and colors, and it doesn't rely on language, which helps avoid some of those bias issues we talked about with the traditional tests.
That makes sense.
Precisely. That ability to take what you've learned and apply it to something new, that's a key element of cognitive flexibility. And the medial temporal lobe.
That's the brain region.
Yeah, a region deep in the brain that we know is affected very early in Alzheimer's.
Yeah.
It plays a critical role in exactly this kind of generalization.
Okay.
And the research team also developed another way to look at what's happening in the brain using magnetic resonance imaging, or MRI. They use it to assess something they call brain flexibility.
Brain flexibility. That's an interesting term. When they talk about brain flexibility in this context, what are they actually measuring or looking at?
So here, brain flexibility refers to how dynamically the neurons communicate with each other, both within and around the hippocampus.
The memory center.
Right, the key memory area we mentioned is impacted early in Alzheimer's. The MRI scans help the researchers see if there are any declines in this neural communication, essentially, how well different parts of the brain's memory center can adapt and interact with each other, kind of like how adaptable the network is.
Got it. So they're looking at performance on the game and also how flexible the communication is in that key brain area using MRI. Now let's get into the specifics of this particular study. Who are the people who participated and what do they actually have to do?
Okay, so the study involved 148 older adults, and crucially, they were all cognitively healthy at the start.
No signs of impairment yet.
Right. And it's really important to note that everyone who participated in this specific study identified as African American.
And why was that focus chosen?
Well, the researchers highlight this as significant because statistically, African Americans are more than twice as likely to develop Alzheimer's compared to other racial groups. Yet historically, they are often underrepresented in research focused on aging and Alzheimer's disease.
That's such a crucial point about making sure research actually includes diverse populations, especially those disproportionately affected.
So these participants, they went through a whole series of different assessments, right?
Yes, that's right. They completed a battery of cognitive tests, which included that video game generalization task we just discussed.
Okay.
They also provided blood samples. The researchers then analyzed these samples to look for specific proteins, biomarkers, that are known to be associated with Alzheimer's.
Like the tau and amyloid we hear about.
Exactly, specific forms of tau and amyloid beta ratios. And finally, they underwent those MRI brain scans to assess the flexibility, that dynamic network communication, in the medial temporal lobe region. Wow, so quite comprehensive. Game performance, blood markers, and brain imaging. And the main goal then was to see how all these different pieces of information fit together.
Precisely. How were the results from the cognitive tests, the brain imaging data, and the levels of those proteins in the blood related to each other in these healthy older adults?
So what were the key things they discovered? What were the big findings?
One of the most important findings was a really clear link between how well someone performed on the video game, the generalization task, and the flexibility they observed in their medial temporal lobe via the MRI.
Okay, so better game performance
Meant greater adaptability and communication within the brain's memory center. What this means for you is that people who were better at learning and applying those rules in the game also showed more flexible neural networks in that key brain region.
That makes a lot of intuitive sense, doesn't it? If the memory hub of your brain is more flexible and adaptable, you'd probably be better at tasks that require that kind of mental agility.
It lines up nicely, yes.
And what about those protein markers in the blood? How do they relate to how people did on the video game?
Okay, this is where it gets particularly interesting for understanding those very early changes. The researchers found a significant inverse relationship between performance on the video game and the levels of two specific forms of a protein called tau in the blood.
Inverse meaning.
Meaning higher levels of these specific protein markers, phosphorylated tau 231 and phosphorylated tau 181, were associated with lower scores on the video game task.
Ah, okay. So more of these specific tau proteins in the blood corresponded with worse performance on that learning and generalization game.
Exactly. It suggests these blood markers might be giving us a clue about something happening biologically that's already affecting this subtle cognitive ability, even in people who seem healthy.
And what about the brain flexibility itself, the MRI measure? Did those blood markers also relate to that?
Yes, they did. The study found another significant inverse relationship, this time specifically, between the level of phosphorylated tau 231 and that dynamic network flexibility in the medial temporal lobe.
So again, higher levels of this particular tau marker were linked to reduced flexibility in that critical brain region.
Correct. More p-tau 231, less adaptable communication in the memory network.
That's a really compelling triangle, isn't it? Some specific blood marker linked to both reduced brain network flexibility and poorer performance on this specific cognitive task. Now, the study also looked at amyloid beta, which is, the other key protein often associated with Alzheimer's. What did they find there?
Well, interestingly, in this particular study, they did not find any significant links between the levels of amyloid beta in the blood, specifically the amyloid beta 4:2:40 ratio they measured, and either the performance on the video game or the flexibility in the medial temporal lobe.
Huh. So amyloid wasn't strongly related to these specific measures in this group?
Not in this analysis. And also, none of the blood markers they looked at, including the tau markers, showed a strong relationship with a standard measure of long-term memory recall, something called the Ray Auditory Learning Test Delayed Recall.
Okay, so it seems like these specific forms of the tau protein, especially that phosphorylated tau 231, are showing a much stronger connection to these particular early cognitive and neural changes, the generalization task and the network flexibility, than amyloid beta or even standard memory tests in this specific study population.
That appears to be what the data suggests in this cohort, yes.
So what are the big takeaways from all of this? What are the implications?
Well, the implications for early detection and maybe even our understanding of the disease process are potentially quite significant for you. The finding that higher levels of phosphorylated tau 231 are linked to both poorer performance on the learning task and reduced brain flexibility. Well, it suggests that this blood marker could really reflect the underlying processes of neurodegeneration that are starting to affect cognitive function.
Specifically, this ability to learn and apply new information, the generalization part.
Exactly, that specific cognitive domain. So measuring phosphorylated tau 231 in the blood could potentially become an important way to assess if these subtle cognitive and neural changes are happening in the very, very early stages of Alzheimer's, maybe even before standard memory issues appear.
Right. And this study also seemed to provide more support for the idea that this video game task might actually be a more sensitive way to detect these early changes compared to some of the more traditional cognitive tests we currently rely on.
That's a key point. It might pick up on deficits earlier.
And because these tests are non-invasive, a game you can play and a simple blood test, this could really pave the way for developing early intervention strategies. Things aimed at slowing down or maybe even potentially postponing the progression of Alzheimer's disease.
Absolutely. If you can identify people at this very early stage, you have a much wider window for interventions, whether they're lifestyle changes or future medications.
And furthermore, the researchers, particularly Mark Gluck, they envision a future where this video game test could even be administered remotely, like, on a home computer or a tablet over the internet.
That's a huge potential benefit.
It really could significantly improve access to early screening for individuals who might have difficulty traveling to medical appointments or maybe people who live in more remote areas.
Yeah, it really opens up the possibility of reaching so many more people and making early screening much more widespread and convenient for, well, potentially everyone.
Definitely. Now, as with any piece of research, it's always important to consider what the limitations of the study might be. Did the researchers themselves point out any caveats?
They did, yes. They noted a couple of key limitations. First, the group of people who participated in this study, it had more women than men. So the researchers suggest that future studies should really aim for a more balanced group in terms of sex representation, just to see if there might be any differences between men and women in how these biomarkers, cognitive performance, and brain flexibility are all related.
That's a fair point. Important to make sure the findings apply broadly across sexes. What else did they mention as a limitation?
They also pointed out that this study didn't look at genetic factors that we know influence the risk of Alzheimer's, like the apolipoprotein E gene, often called APOE, or another one, ABCA7.
Right, the genetic risk factors.
Yeah, so future research that includes these genetic markers could give us an even more complete picture of an individual's overall risk profile when combined with these cognitive and blood-based measures.
That makes sense, layering on the genetic information. And we also talked about the fact that all participants in this study were African American. Well, that was really important for addressing underrepresentation. Did that focus also present any limitations in interpretation?
Yes, the researchers acknowledge that because older African Americans have unfortunately been historically underrepresented in broader Alzheimer's research, it makes it a bit more challenging right now to fully understand how these specific findings fit into the larger context of health disparities and the disease across all populations.
So more work is needed there too.
Absolutely. They emphasize that more research specifically within this population is definitely needed to confirm and expand on these findings and also compare them systematically with other groups.
It's just so important to continue this research with diverse groups of people to really get a comprehensive understanding of this disease and, how it affects different populations differently, potentially.
Couldn't agree more.
Now, the researchers involved in this study, they shared some of their thoughts on these findings and the materials we looked at. What were some of their key opinions or takeaways?
Well, as we touched on earlier, the neuroscientist Mark Gleck expressed quite a bit of enthusiasm about the potential for this kind of early warning sign, even before obvious memory problems start showing up.
Right, the pre-symptomatic detection idea.
Exactly. And he really imagines a future where these tests could be easily used, maybe in a regular doctor's office checkup, or even, as we said, done remotely from the comfort of your own home.
And the lead author of the study, Mary Budak, she had a thought on the generalizability, right?
Yes, she expressed the belief that the underlying biological and cognitive relationships they found, this link between p-tau231, generalization, and brain flexibility, are likely applicable to people of all races, even though this particular study focused specifically on African Americans. Of course, more research needed to confirm that broadly.
Understandable. And another researcher involved, Bernadette A. Fausto, made a really important point about how this kind of early information could actually empower individuals to take action, right?
Exactly. She suggested that if people knew their test results indicated these very early changes were happening, they might be more motivated to make healthier lifestyle choices or maybe seek out early interventions, really become more protective of their brain health proactively.
That's a powerful potential outcome.
It is. And the study itself, just reading the paper, it also really underscores how critical the brain's ability to adapt and change, what scientists call neuroplasticity, how critical that is for learning and memory. And it suggests that these elevated tau protein markers, especially p-tau231, may actually reflect the ongoing processes of neurodegeneration that are starting to impact not just cognitive function, but also the fundamental dynamics of how neurons communicate in the brain's memory center.
So wrapping this up, what does all of this mean for you, our listener? This research, it really provides a pretty promising glimpse into a future where we might be able to detect Alzheimer's disease much, much earlier.
And crucially, through non-invasive methods, a blood test, potentially at a stage where interventions, whatever they may be in the future, could be far more effective than they are today.
What's truly significant here, I think, is the potential for a real shift in how we approach Alzheimer's altogether. Instead of primarily reacting once symptoms become obvious and perhaps significant damage has occurred,
we could move towards proactively identifying risk and implementing preventative or early intervention strategies much, much earlier in the course of the disease.
it really raises an important question for you to think about. How might widespread, easy-to-use early detection tools like this fundamentally change how we think about and manage brain health as we age? For ourselves, for our loved ones.
Indeed. And maybe consider this final thought. If a simple, maybe even engaging video game could provide an early warning sign, how might that empower you and others to make more informed decisions about your lifestyle, your healthcare choices, and your overall future well-being?
It's a lot to think about. This deep dive into the research from Rutgers really does point toward a hopeful new direction in our ongoing quest to understand and ultimately address Alzheimer's disease.
Thanks for tuning in to the Health Headliner podcast by To Digital. Like and subscribe for more health news and breakthroughs. Stay healthy and informed. See you next time.